Start by talking or let's start the discussion on Unit 9, which is centralized and decentralizations or decentralized political system. So to begin with, in any representative democracy or country like Papua New Guinea, Australia, New Zealand, there is always this talk on the state's role in the country, the state's role in the society. So in the midst of this discussion, there is this notion or the concept of centralized government and decentralized government, or a centralized system and a decentralized system. Why is this important? This is important because the way in which the government governs a country in a representative democracy, including Papua New Guinea, it's a discussion or negotiation between the state's role, whether it's centralized, being administered in a central location, or it's decentralized. Decentralized meaning that functions of the state is given to other areas or locations, or in our case, given to other provinces. So we are going to look at this concept or this unit of Unit 9 of centralized and decentralized political system. Now as we begin, let's look at the objectives here. So in the objectives, number 1, number 2, number 3, number 1 is, after this unit we will try to outline the three forces that shapes the degree of centralization in a political system. And second objective, we are going to look at the difference between the unitary and federal system of government. And thirdly, we have to describe the origins and features of a provincial government system in Papua New Guinea. So we will be looking at the, let's say, the theories of the idea of centralized, decentralized political system. We try to look at the differences between what is called the unitary and the federal system, or unitary and federal state, and then we will look at how Papua New Guinea is situated in this line of discussion. Okay, let's move on. Now I'll skip introduction and we'll look at the notion of centralization and decentralization. And I'll read. As discussions in Unit 11, the questions of centralization and decentralization arise in every political system. Modern states need to establish practical systems to decide how much policy making is decided by the central government and how much the other levels of government. So important here in this first paragraph, it talks about the importance of policy making. Okay, so sometimes policy making is decided by the central government, or sometimes policy making is delegated to other, let's say, subnational governments, as in provincial government. But the importance of the idea of centralization and decentralization is that the government can either take ownership of the policy and administer it, let's say, in Waigani, or it can give that same particular task to the subnational government or the provincial government. Let's look at the second sentence or the second paragraph. So Blondel, 1995, okay, that's the reading, provides a simple and practical definition of centralization and decentralization. Important here is that centralization is where the proportion of public policy decisions taken in a country by the central authorities tend to be large to very large. On the other hand, decentralization is where the proportion of public policy decision making in a country by central authorities tend to be small to very small. Okay, so this is the idea here. So in these two differences, centralization is actually talking about, or in other words, you have a big government. Okay? A big government controls everything at the center. That's one definition of it. So proportion of public policy is controlled at the center. That's why you need a big government to control decentralization. So when you have a big government, then the idea of centralization becomes important. Okay, and the other definition is that the decentralization creates small government. Okay, why would the government needs to be bigger when it delegates its power to the subnational government? Okay, so decentralization, in other words, is having a small government. Okay, so having a small government meaning that most of the task of public policy making is given to the subnational government. That is why in this definition here, Blondel said that centralization is associated with big governments. Decentralization is associated with small governments. Now let's move on. Now let's look at the forces of decentralization. Reading 11 suggests that there are three kinds of forces that account for differences in the degree of centralization or decentralization in individual countries. So depending on the type of country or individual countries, like Papua New Guinea is different from Australia, or Papua New Guinea is different from, let's say, the United Kingdom, very much in terms of its political makeup, its geographical location, geography, cultural, all this makes it different, okay, in its nature. So the difference in the makeup also calls for whether the government needs to be big in centralization or small in decentralization. In the reading here, in the text here, the three forces that makes the government big or makes the government small can be found in its ideology, structural, and efficiencies. Okay, these three forces here shapes whether the government is big or the government is small. Now let's look at these three forces here, and you can read it in reading 11 of your resource book. Now the three forces here: number one, ideology; number two, structural; number three, efficiency. Let's look at ideology. Read. Ideology helps to justify or reject a particular stance on centralization and decentralization. We've looked at liberalization. So liberalization in our discussion on ideology centers around the idea of individual, not communal. Okay? So liberalization, the idea of liberalization, if it's centered on individual and individualistic approach, then a big government will not work in this kind of environment. In a liberal country, they don't like big government because big government tends to infringe or tends to interfere with the idea of individual. Okay. So a good example would be countries like the United States, United Kingdom. They always try to have, or I'll put it this way, the capitalist countries always advocate for small government. Why? Because they argue that big government does not represent the interest of the ideas of liberalization. So, in that note and on that example here, so the political ideology of liberalization made it in such a way that the countries in Europe, United States, and even in Australia and New Zealand would not want to advocate or opt for a big government. Rather, they would want a small government. Okay? So that's one force that can influence whether a country has a big government or small government, or a country is as a centralization system or a decentralization system. Now, secondly is structural. I read, the structural forces are the second group of forces that play a substantial role in shaping the degree of centralization or decentralization. Structural forces include conflicts in society, such as conflict between Bougainville and the national government. Here it gives you an example here, so structural forces. Now, right before independence, leading into independence, Bougainville wanted to move in its separate direction from Papua New Guinea. Now, when Bougainville wanted to do that, a compromise was met or arranged, and that compromise came through the 1977 Organic Law on the Provincial and Provincial Government System. The 1977 Organic Law on the Provincial Government System paved the way for the kind of decentralization system that we have. Since 1884, up until 1949 to 1973, Papua New Guinea has been governed through a centralized system, meaning that there is a very big government system or a big government in Papua New Guinea, centered in Konidogo. Now, after the issue with Bougainville, which is a structural issue that made it for the government to rethink the centralization system, and as a way of compromise to settle the revolt or the sentiments that is coming from Bougainville, the 1977 provincial government system was introduced, and the decentralization system was established in Papua New Guinea. So that is a structural issue. A structural issue would dictate whether a government opted for a centralized system or a decentralized system. The other issue or the other force is efficiency. I read. So what is this efficiency notion? The efficiency of a government system has become an increasingly important issue in debates about centralization and decentralization. Previously, decentralization or decentralized systems were criticized as they created duplication. However, the emphasis now changed and decentralization is taking place in the context of some unitary states in order to avoid inefficiency of centralized bureaucracy. Now, Scotland, and I'll try to give you an example. Now, the idea of efficiency. When you have a decentralized government, okay, like Papua New Guinea. Let's take, for example, Papua New Guinea in the discussion. So the idea of efficiency comes about when you have, let's say, the National Department of Works here in Port Moresby, and then you have Provincial Department of Works in the provinces. Now, sometimes the duplication of roles, meaning that there are instances where the provincial government, the Department of Provincial Works will say, that highway from Namatanai is a national highway. So why would we, the province, fix the national highway? Because it's categorized under the national highway. So the National Works Department should take charge of that highway. Now, I'm not saying it's happening, but such instances occur. When there's duplication of roles and responsibility, the dilemma is that who is responsible for that particular piece of road? Now, when that happens, it affects the road condition. And when that happens, it questions the efficiency in which the matters, the deteriorating road conditions on Namatanai will take longer years, and that affects, let's say, the people in the area. So that example is in line with what is that example tries to portray the idea of efficiency. So when you have a big government, a centralized system where the Department of let's say Works Department is fixing all the roads in the country, then if there's an issue with the road in Namatanai, then the national department will be better equipped to fix the road rather than trying to see who is responsible for fixing the road. So that's the idea of efficiency. So this idea of efficiency also affects the way in which the country may opt for a centralized system or a decentralized system. Okay, let's move on to the unitary state system, or unitary systems of government, centralized power. Now, when talking about big government, small government, decentralization, centralization system, let's say in order to put meaning to those discussions, we can see it through what is called the unitary system of government and the federal system of government. The unitary system of government is a centralized system of government. So in a unitary state, you would see there is a very big government in charge of public policy. In a federal system, you would see that a small government in charge of public policy. So unitary is associated with centralized system. Federal system is associated, or federal systems of government is associated with decentralization. Okay, so let's look at unitary. A unitary system of government is where an ultimate power resides with the national government. That should give you, let's say, the meaning of what unitary system is. Highlight this sentence here. So importantly is that ultimate power resides with the national government. Ultimate power meaning that in our earlier example, the power to fix national or Namatanai highway rests with the central government in a unitary state. Let's look at the second paragraph and I'll read. In a unitary system, component government may exist, but their responsibilities are delegated from the central government. So let's say, look at Papua New Guinea again, and let's look at the Namatanai highway case. So in a centralized government, although the power to fix the national highway rests with the central government, there is also an office, provincial office of works existed in New Island. However, that provincial works office or department of provincial works will not fix the road unless it is given directions from the central government. Okay? So that gives you this idea of, although there is a component of government exists in those areas, the final decision had to or must come from the central government. Okay, let me read the third paragraph. In recent decades, there have been increasing attempts to push responsibility for more functions away from the central government. We can distinguish three broad ways in which unitary states can disperse power from the center. So, back to our example, I said that there is an existing office, let's say in New Island, and that belongs to the Department of Works. Now, for example, the direction from the central government to New Island to fix Namatana Highway, okay, is given through, or the powers is given, or dispersed is the right word, is dispersed from the center, okay, through this, let's say, administered through these items here. It's administered through, number one, deconcentration, number two, decentralization, number three, devolution. Now let's look at the three important components here of dispersing this power under the unitary system. Deconcentration, this is purely a method of administrative organization. It refers to locations of central government employees away from the capital. For example, a public official might be located in the provincial center instead of Port Moresby. So you have, let's say, provincial, in a deconcentration, the example of a disconcentration, disperse of power, let's say an officer of the Department of Works is stationed in New Island. So if ever there is an issue of road construction, road works, he will be in charge of delivering the task that is given to him by the central government. Now that power given to the particular office or the officer is delivered through what is called the deconcentration of power. Now secondly is decentralization. This means delegating policy execution to subnational bodies, provincial governments. Political decentralization of this form aims to give citizens and the elected representatives more power in local public decision making and greater influence over the public policy that affect their lives. Now, coming back to our example here, in a decentralization dispersion of power, instead of the public officer in charge in the New Island province, to deliberate the instructions from the central government, the central government has the power to delegate or give some of its decision-making power to the provincial government. So let's say it gives certain funding and certain instruction to the provincial government. Let's say a certain portion of the road from the Matanai is given to the provincial government and the community to be responsible over. Okay, let's say you have national highways and then Namatain national highways, and then you have offshoots of those roads leading into the villages. Take for that example. Okay, so those offshoots of roads leading to those villages are given to the provincial government to take care of. Now it becomes a community responsibility. So ever if there is a road concern along those offshoots of roads going into a particular village, those village or community will consult, let's say, the provincial, the village chief or councillors or the presidents, and that they will bring that up to the provincial government. The power to fix those roads is given to the people and the provincial government. That is an example of dispersion of decentralization powers, in a unitary state. Now last is devolution. I'll read. This occurs when the center grants autonomy in decision making, including some legislative powers to subnational levels of government. For example, if national government transfers responsibility and legislative authority for poor and unimaginable example. I'll start again. Okay, for example, if the national government transfers responsibility and legislative power for poor and unimaginable example to the provincial government, this would be an example of devolution. Now, in the decentralization case, although the powers have been given to, let's say, the communities and provincial government to fix the road, let's say the funding grants and some form of decision making is still tied to the central government. Now, in the devolution case, or the devolution, the state now puts all responsibilities, duties and responsibilities to the provincial government. That's an example. An example of it would be, let's say, the kind of autonomy that Bougainville has, or the kind of autonomy that other provincial governments are fighting for in Papua New Guinea. So the evolution of power means that the central government now relinquish its authority in any form or in any way to, or left to the provincial government to administer. Okay? So, if you look at the three dispersion of power, the concentration basically states as overall authority over. Decentralization states as, okay, although it has certain powers, okay, that belongs to the state, most of the decision making is sometimes given to the provincial government to deliberate on. Devolution, meaning that the provincial government are at will, okay? The state is only there to, let's say, regulate, but the state does not have any influence over the public policy decisions in, let's say, a particular area. Now let's look at the federal system of government. Now, a federal system of government is one where legal sovereignty is shared between national and the constituent states. Highlight this, the first sentence. Legal sovereignty, meaning that there is a, let's say, a very big difference, or there is a legal line being drawn up between the state and the subnational government. So two examples here are Australia and United States. So in Australia we have the Australian government, but you have how many states? 5 states. Queensland, New South Wales, Victoria. These are all states. They have their own, okay, legal, let's say, they have their own sovereignty within the Australian state itself. So the state, okay, does not have full control over, or the Australian national government does not have full control over public decision making in the 5 states of Australia. So a federal system is such a way that the only difference that you will see in a federal system is that there exists a legal sovereignty between the state and the national government. Second paragraph, a federal system therefore includes 2 layers of government with specific functions and powers allocated to each level. The central government is typically responsible for external relations, and that is defense, foreign affairs and immigration. When it comes to defense force or defense of the country, foreign affairs of the country and immigration, that is, okay, being controlled by the national government. Let's say the Australian national government is in charge of the defense, Australian Defence Force, Australian foreign affairs and immigration, and to some extent some common domestic functions such as currency and communication. The functions of states vary but often include education and law enforcement. So the state, in terms of, for example, in Australia, in terms of education and, let's say, law enforcement, the state in different territories or different states in Australia, the laws is not the same. Okay? Let's say in the United States, states like Texas, they are more conservative in such a way that you would see that they would not, when it comes to abortion instance, laws of abortion are not favorable, or they would not support abortion. The state laws in Texas will not support abortion comparing to state laws in New York. So New York state laws will support abortion, but not in Texas. Why? Because of this kind of federal system that is being involved here. So there is a legal sovereignty between the two states. So the national government, the United States government, cannot come in and dictate the way Texas will vote for abortion, or cannot come in and dictate the way New York will vote for abortion. New York has its own code, legal code and ethics. Texas has its own legal code and ethics. You will commonly, or you will find this in federal systems of government. That is the notion of decentralization system. Okay, let's move on. Okay, in a federal system tends to emerge for at least three important reasons. A federal system emerges because of size number one, diversity number two, and power number three. Now let's look at size and array. Federal system address the problem of large governments. Decentralization allows far away and remote regions to feel that not all decisions are made from them in a distant capital. You look at the size of Australia and you look at the size of the United States. Australia is a very, very big country. The United States is a very, very big landmass, or country itself. So it will not make sense to have a unitary system of government or a centralized system of government. How can a centralized system of government in the United States govern a very big, large landmass of people that are living, not compact but sparsely? So that's one reason why a federal system of government is suited for those countries that have a very big landmass. Size number one. Number two is diversity. Federal systems are often established in societies where there is substantial degree of linguistic, religious, and cultural diversity. You look at India, you look at, Australia, the United States. United States, let's say, diversity tends to be around religion and now more or less ethnic. So when you have different types or different races of people living together, it will not make sense to have a unitary system. So diversity also contributes to countries adopting federal system of government. And number three, power. Federal systems provide one way of checking government power. So when constitutional powers are divided between levels of government, power is not concentrated with a single unit. In effect, a federal system of government controls itself as one group of politicians and can never entirely defeat the ambitions of another. So when it comes to accountability, then federal system, accountability of power, then federal system is fitted or suited to keep tabs on the abuse of power from the state. So you have, let's look at United States for that matter. In a federal system, normally in a federal system, you have the head of the federal state is the president. President is in charge of foreign affairs, defense, and immigration. Now, if you look at the immigration policy of Donald Trump, you would see that the state level is trying to, or Trump's policy is to try to deport illegal immigrants from the United States. But Trump is facing challenges because the courts in different states are making it hard for Donald Trump to deport immigrants, illegal immigrants. Now, some immigrants are genuine and living in the United States, some are not genuine living in the United States. Now, what happens if Donald Trump deports most or a lot of genuine and not genuine immigrants? Or, to that matter, if he finds out that a political opposition group that are not giving him votes belong to a certain, let's say, Hispanic minority or Hispanic groups, then in order to break, let's say, the Democrats' power in reliance of Hispanic voters, he wants to use his executive power as the president, okay, to remove them so that he can, let's say, hypothetically stay in power. In that case, he can't do that because of the federal system in place. He can't just deport all immigrants from the United States. What he has to do is to go through due processes and also meet the requirements of the state laws of every state in the United States. Some state laws are favorable towards illegal, or let's say immigrants. Some states are not favorable to immigrants. So the President of the United States had to be mindful of those, okay, legal sovereignties of those states in such a way that sort of keeps, let's say, the accountability or checks of power of the office of the President. So here, these are the three reasons in which a country has adopted a federal system. Now let's look at Papua New Guinea. So what we've discussed so far, we've looked at the idea of centralization, decentralization. Centralization talks about big government. Decentralization talks about small government. Now, in the political systems, especially in a representative democracy, they either adopt what is called a unitary state and a federal state. A unitary state is associated with big government. A federal state is associated with small government. And you know, and we went through the characteristics of a unitary state and the characteristics of a federal state. Now let's look at how Papua New Guinea is fitted into this idea of decentralization, unitary and federal state system. Now, if you want to talk about Papua New Guinea, let's look at how Papua New Guinea adopted or fall into this arrangement here. And I'll read. So the politics of provincial government system in Papua New Guinea is discussed in reading, okay, you read reading 12. A decentralization policy was first proposed for Papua New Guinea by the Constitutional Planning Committee. Prior to independence, the justification revolved around the very nature of the country and the reaction to centralized Australian colonial rule. So, the Constitutional Planning Committee, or the CPC report, in its report opted for a decentralization system. That is because from 1884 up until 1973, Australian government, colonial administration, have been administering Papua New Guinea through a centralized system, a unitary state system of government, where you have Konidobu, who is controlling public policy making over the territories of Papua and New Guinea. So one of the recommendations was to have a decentralization system. And I read, after much debate and following the breakdown of talks of Bougainville's secessionist, Michael Sumare, late Grand Chief Michael Sumare, successfully removed provincial government from the constitution. Prior to 1977, 1975, there was discussion of decentralization, but the Somali cabinet opted to remove decentralization, okay, out from the discussion. And I'll read. The provincial government system that was subsequently introduced included 19 provinces and a separate national district, each with a provincial assembly. From an early stage, provincial government came under fire from its critics, particularly from national and local politicians who had at least gained from the introduction of provinces. So here, the Somali government opted not to go with the decentralization system as recommended by CPC. Right after the Bougainville, let's say, affair, or the secessionist movement on the island of Bougainville, the government was forced to introduce this decentralization system in 1976. And that gave the that's the establishment of the 1977 provincial government system. Now let me see, 1, 2, 3, 4th paragraph, or 5th paragraph, and I'll read. The initial organic law on provincial government provides provincial governments with secure basis on which to exercise their powers and provide services. The first activities or expenditure policies transferred from the national government to the provincial government included provincial affairs, health, primary industry, education, business development, extension services, capital works, maintenance, and bureau of management services. Okay, so I'm trying to see whether the discussion stated in the study guide here related to the theories and the discussions that we had before coming to talk about Papua New Guinea. So let me put it this way. Papua New Guinea, although it's a decentralization, or we are talking about decentralization system, Papua New Guinea is not a federal system. That we must understand that. Okay? We've talked about centralization, decentralization. Papua New Guinea is a unitary system. Why I said that? Because under a unitary state, there is this power of decentralization. The provinces have not yet given the legal sovereignty to become a state in Papua New Guinea. Although you can have an argument for Bougainville, after Bougainville referendum, but Bougainville is a separate case. Apart from Bougainville, other provinces are not given legal sovereignty. All laws, whether it be national or Supreme Court, the provinces, all laws in the country are subjected to the same, let's say, or all laws have been administered by the same constitution of Papua New Guinea. There is no differences in provincial laws and national or state laws in Papua New Guinea. We have only one law. In the United States, you have the state laws, or the national laws, and the state laws. Okay, differences. So Papua New Guinea is a unitary state. Now, in Papua New Guinea case, the CPC report proposed recommendation for decentralization, but the Chief Minister, okay, late Grand Chief Michael Somare, opted not to go for decentralization. However, in 1975, the revolt or the issue of Bougainville came on board, and that is the reason why the government has opted for the 1977 decentralization system. So in our case, certain powers of decision making is given to the provinces. But to that effect, the provinces are not independent solely, or are not independent or not given legal sovereignty to make its own decisions without in consultation with the state. So that's the difference. So do not confuse our system of government to be federal system. Our system of government is unitary. Okay, so we will stop here, and let me go back and make a summary of this Unit 9. Okay, so in a centralized, decentralized discussion of political system, you would commonly find this in representative democracy. So centralized political system is in a way talking about a system that advocate or encourage a big government presence in the country or in the society. In a decentralized discussion, it's talking about or advocating for a small government in a system. All right? And then we moved on to talk about the political system itself can be broken down into two, whether it be unitary or federal system. Unitary system advocate for the argument of centralization, having big government. In a unitary state, the central government has the ultimate power of public policy making. In a central or federal system of government, argue or advocate for a small government. In a small government or in a federal system, the central government does not have the ultimate state. There is what is called legal sovereignty between states, depending on how many states they have. The national government only controls foreign affairs, immigration, and security or defense. Now, where does that put Papua New Guinea? Papua New Guinea's history since 1884 have been very much guided by the centralization argument. Although the CPC report has opted for some form of decentralization, this has not come about until the Bougainville secessionist movement. When that happened, as a compromise, the government had established the 1976 or 1977 organic law on provincial government system. Now, the provincial government system allows for the establishment of other provinces. So Papua New Guinea is a unitary state, but has allowed for some form of decentralization through the establishment of the 1977 organic law on provincial government system, and then 1995 organic law on provincial and local government system, and then various changes to legislation in the decentralization policy. So Papua New Guinea is a unitary state. However, Papua New Guinea has established laws to open up space for decentralization to take place. But Papua New Guinea is not a federal system. Some academic scholars would argue that Papua New Guinea is a quasi-federal system. If we are advocating for autonomy at the present argument, talking about autonomy, then we are slowly moving away to this quasi-federal system arrangement or argument. But that's another discussion for another time. But important in this Unit 9 is that we've established the idea of centralized and decentralized discussion, and how that influence whether a state to adopt a unitary state or a federal state. And then we've concluded that Papua New Guinea, in its makeup, has adopted a unitary system of government through its history, and as a result of tensions on the island of Bougainville, has opted for a decentralization system to be in place, and that is through the 1977 Organic Law and Council Government system. Now, Papua New Guinea is unique in itself that although it is a unitary system, it has adopted some form of level of decentralization in its unitary states. Okay, and that concludes the lecture for Unit 9.